Welcome to another episode of If You Can Keep It, podcast of Keep Our Republic. My name is Ari Mittleman, and I serve as the executive director of this great nonprofit. It's an honor to work with our entire team, especially great legal minds like our two guests today. David Hickton and John Vaudreuil both served as U.S. attorneys at the same time. Dave in the Western District of Pennsylvania and John in the Western District of Wisconsin. I rely on their counsel and their perspective each week as we work together to help strengthen our democracy in both Wisconsin and Pennsylvania.
When Ben Franklin was leaving the Constitution Hall, he was asked if the founders had decided to have a republic or an autocracy. And he said, "We have a republic if we can keep it."
Gentlemen, thanks so much for taking the time, and more so, thanks for being in the trenches of our judicial system over the years. I think more and more Americans are hearing the term U.S. attorney. Let's be honest, the average Americans don't stop and think about the role of a U.S. attorney, but we're just hearing it a lot more in the popular media in recent years. So among other reasons, I was very excited to have you on the podcast. Maybe both of you could just share what drew you to the law earlier in your career. We have lots of student listeners, and what was it about the law, and then specifically about the role of being a prosecutor?
Dave, do you want to take the lead and I'll follow you?
Sure, happy to. In my case, it was the fact that my father went to night law school when I was a young boy, from ages 6 to 8. He was at Duquesne Night Law School. He was working full time. We had 5 children, a very active family. And what drew me to it was the interest of the subject matter, but really what I remember about that time was all of his friends. And particularly after he graduated, he immediately went into the active practice of law. And I was struck by how the lawyers that he litigated cases with fought furiously during the day and then socialized in the evening and socialized over the weekends, that they could agree to disagree so vehemently in their work, but remain friends. And that's something I think we're missing today.
That's my background with this is a little different. There were no lawyers in my family except for a great uncle in 1908 who I didn't know. I liked the people aspect of it. I liked speaking. I liked trying to reach out to people. I liked writing. And I think ultimately I liked being able to solve discrete problems, which drew me to being a prosecutor. And it'll link into what we're talking about today. I like to deal in facts and truth. And I thought that's ultimately what being a prosecutor is: dealing in facts, dealing in proof, not dealing in theories. And that's my way of thinking, somewhat pragmatically. So that drew me to going to law school, and then ultimately drew me into the criminal law, which was the only thing I did for all my career.
Let's talk a little about a fact. Western Wisconsin and Western Pennsylvania are going to be ground zero in the coming months of the political season. And maybe you can just give listeners, we'll start with you, John, a little flavor of the very diverse communities across the state of Wisconsin, but particularly in the Western District in which you served. And then Dave, we'll go to you as we branch out outside of Pittsburgh.
I usually summarize it very briefly this way. We are the state that back in 1914 with Robert La Follette was a leader in progressive government and the progressive movement. We're also the state that elected several times Senator McCarthy. So we are a very divided state, although historically not angrily so, I don't think. And that's what it looks like now. There's a group that I know there was just an article about it called North of Highway 29, which is where I grew up, the state that runs west to east across Wisconsin. And they are all about certainly the Second Amendment, but they're really all about, let's turn the clock back as I see it. Let's hand count. And I suspect they would be for turning the clock back on any sort of technological voting advances that would help. So that's the state. It's a rural state largely. Almost all the votes really come from Madison and Milwaukee. But so in statewide elections, there's at least 2 very large, relatively liberal communities, if you want to think of it that way. And the rest of the state, which has less people, is rural and fairly conservative.
Well, with regard to Pennsylvania, America was born here, and I'm from Western Pennsylvania, and sometimes I sound like the head of the Chamber of Commerce because I'm very proud of the fact that the American Industrial Revolution really had its home here. Andrew Carnegie and U.S. Steel, John Rockefeller and Standard Oil and other big companies, which really defined our growth in the late 1800s. The American labor movement had its roots here. The largest union in North America is here. I really love the people of Western Pennsylvania. They are salt of the earth. They're hardworking people who believe in the American dream. They really want to be patriotic. They want to work hard. They want to know that if you work hard, you can really earn all the promises and benefits of our founding documents. And so it's a very patriotic place, a very hardworking place, and wonderful people here.
As each of you look back, a lot has changed in the last decade in the United States, in the body politic, and just the role in which the United States plays in the world and an ever complicated world. But go back about a decade, 2013, both of you were serving as U.S. Attorney. During your tenure, any marquee cases, both good, bad, and ugly, that stand out during your tenures?
Well, Dave, take the lead.
Yeah, in my case, I was very proud to create a dedicated civil rights division in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Pittsburgh in partnership with Tom Perez, who was a friend of John's and mine. And John was consulting with me because we were in the same U.S. Attorney class. And that was a huge initiative. And then also created a dedicated national security cyber group. Those two sections really led the way for some of the cases that I really remember. In cyber, we indicted the Chinese army for intellectual property theft, and we indicted the most notorious Russian cyber hacker. We did 50 other cases, including we led the investigation into the 2016 interference in the election by Russia. In civil rights cases, we did a lot of criminal cases, excessive force cases in prisons and by the police. We also did some very important civil cases relating to solitary confinement in prisons and abolishing that practice for mental health inmates. And I'm very proud of that work. Also was chair of the National Heroin Task Force. We were at the front end of the work on the opioid crisis, which was really important and ahead of its time.
I think from my perspective in our district, in terms of cases, real quickly, the one that comes to mind was our prosecution of Sinovel, a Chinese company, 2 Chinese nationals, and a Serbian national. And none of those 3 have ever come to trial because they live in countries where we don't have extradition treaties. They did a fraud, a theft of intellectual property that we could not link to the Chinese government, even though we certainly suspected that was the case. Cost an American company $800 million. It was a big deal out here. Of course, in the cyber world, our connection to it is a small office outside of Madison with a server. Everything else took place really in cyber world all across the world. Otherwise, I think what I remember most vividly wasn't a case, but I'd been an assistant U.S. attorney for 30 years when I was made U.S. attorney by President Obama. And I thought to myself that it has to be more than me just doing bigger cases and our office doing bigger cases. And I spent untold amount of time driving around the district. We have 6 Native American reservations who nobody'd really ever gone to speak with. We have, I think, 11 or 12 mosques, which may not sound like much in large areas, but it's a lot, from a Somali mosque in the little teeny town of Barron to a mosque with mainly Pakistani friends in central Wisconsin. And I was there time after time, sitting on the floor, talking about what Dave just alluded to. My goal was to talk to the possible targets of civil rights crimes before those crimes occurred. So they would know they had a friend. There would be a face, this face, unfortunately for them, perhaps, this face for the Department of Justice. And when it was all said and done, and I was leaving in March of 2017, that's what I was really, I think, most proud of. The fact that the notes I got, the letters I got from people in our Native American communities and people in our Muslim communities, people in our LGBTQ community, because they knew during our time, Gabe's the same, we knew they were there. We wanted to respect them and we wanted to have their back before any problems occurred.
Well, I think I speak for all listeners when I say thank you. We could spend hours probably going deep into the weeds, and there's probably a book or a movie to be had about some of these cases. John, earlier you spoke eloquently about facts, and quite unfortunately, according to FBI crime statistics, hate is on the rise in the United States year on year. In your state, John, there was the tragic attack in August of 2012 on the Sikh house of worship. And then Dave, and you're in a neighborhood very well, the most violent anti-Semitic attack in October of 2018. So maybe you could speak to with an eye as we pivot to talk more about the landscape, the threat landscape, just the rise in hate as you see it, and then also what, if anything, can be done from a prosecutorial lens.
Regarding that in Wisconsin and going back to the Sikh temple shootings, murders, two things come immediately to mind. First, how we do things resonates all over the world. I'll tell you a very short, quick story. I was doing some training in Bangkok. Of course, I went to a really good tailor. I thought I'm going to have a great suit made. Rajawansi tailor, I will tell you. Victor and Jesse. Any event, I go there and I'm handing them my business card so they can write down my information so I can pay. And as soon as I hand Jesse the card, he goes, "Oh, they're Sikhs, I should say. They're two Sikh gentlemen, father and son." They go, "Oh, you're from the state where the Sikhs were murdered. Thank you for all you did for the people." And I came back, and when I would speak at counterterrorism conferences in my district, I would say, "You think when you stop a Sikh or a Muslim or a foreign person, nobody knows?" And I tell that story, and I say, everybody knows. They knew in this instance that from the U.S. Attorney, my good friend Jim Santel for the Eastern District, to the FBI, to Attorney General Holder, everybody responded. So how we treat people resonates all over the world. And in what I do now and then, which is travel a lot to teach, I see it all the time. The second thing about that and about the current climate of hate, I sit on the board now of a group here in Wisconsin called United Against Hate, started by Masood Akhtar, a man of Indian heritage, American citizen, Muslim. But one of our board members is Pardeep. His father was a Sikh leader who was murdered at the Gurdwara. The other person on our board, his first name is Arno. Arno was a white supremacist whose actions he firmly believes led and inspired the murderer. They sit on our board. We make presentations together about how something has to come from that sort of hate. And Arno's way of thinking about it is to speak to everybody about how we can break the cycle of hate. And it isn't by screaming at those haters, even though we want to. It's by trying to listen to why they became what they became. And he tells his story. And Pardeep, who is his best friend, who should be his worst enemy, talks about how we cannot sink to that. And he speaks about how he has tried to make good from the death, the murder of his father and friends. So when I think of the tragedy at the Gurdwara, I think of those two things, how what we do and how we do it messages all over the world. People still look to us. And secondly, how we can take pain and hopefully use it to address the causes of hate, whether it's unemployment, whether it's education, whether it's poverty, anger, and address it in the way that Arno says led him to being a white supremacist.
Well, in my case, I was doing a lot of the outreach along parallel lines that John talked about earlier. But at the front end of my tenure from 2010 to 2016, I did a cross-burning case, which was one of several that I did, which stunned me. That in that period of time, we were still having people engaging in that historical, despicable act of hatred. Also, working with DOJ Community Relations broke up at least a half dozen Ku Klux Klan rallies by engaging directly in the people who intended to have that rally to try and confront their hatred and understand their hatred and to try and do community building. And then at the back end of my tenure, I think the last indictment I signed was the first Shepherd Bird indictment done in our district, which was a hate crime. So it was all around me. What happened at Tree of Life in 2018 was my worst nightmare. The shooting in Wisconsin at the Sikh temple had a tremendous impact upon me. And as a direct result of that, I increased my outreach, particularly in the interfaith community. And I built an interfaith network of all the leaders of the various faith groups in Western Pennsylvania. I took those leaders, who were, again, people who were potential targets of those who would hate, to our combined law enforcement so that they could meet them and so that we could accelerate the response of law enforcement in the event of an unfortunate accident. There was the hiring of a retired FBI agent to assist the Jewish community before the Tree of Life, because we were worried about that happening. And there were naysayers, including people who followed me, who thought that work was soft and unimportant and didn't lead to the filing of cases to get case statistics, which made me crazy, because I didn't think there was anything we did which was more important than be the face of the Department of Justice in the community, to be welcoming to people who might be targets of hate crimes, and to try and reduce that for the community at large. A large piece of that was trying to create dialogue with people and confront people who had hate in their heart, to try to understand why that was so. Unfortunately, as you point out, Ari, hate is still on the rise. I don't feel that we failed. I really feel if you look at the response in Pittsburgh to the terrible Tree of Life shooting, a lot of the community resiliency was built by our good work in the years before. Just look at the way the Islamic Center of Pittsburgh, which I engaged with directly, stepped forward and put their arms around the Jewish community. And that's one example of many. But it's something that's just a continuing effort. It's vital. It's essential. We can't survive as a country if we cannot get to the heart of the problem of hate in America.
So I just want to pivot as we wind down. Both of you have been super generous with your time. We alluded to foreign actors. We're about a year out from what I imagine is going to be the most just divisive election in our lifetimes. Seeing all sorts of, there's been allusions to elections in the 1860s, but it certainly is. It's going to be razor thin in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. So we've alluded to the foreign actors, and we've also alluded to cyber. And this is something, Dave, that you have such expertise with. If you were a bad actor sitting overseas, looking at this angst across America, knowing the tools in the toolbox when it comes to cyber, how would you spend the next year?
Well, it would be a feast, because all you have to do is just continue to push buttons and pit Americans against Americans, which is exactly what Russia's been doing. Look, as I mentioned earlier, in the 2016 election, there were two questions: whether Russia was meddling or whether others here in the United States were in cahoots with them. I never was involved in that second question. I have a point of view, and it seems to me that any one of your listeners ought to just look at the bipartisan Senate report that seems to have conclusively resolved that question. What I was engaged in was the question of Russian interference, which was real and happened, and it happened in all 50 states. Russian interference had two lanes. One was finagling with our election machinery and infiltrating through cyber hacking the election offices in all 50 states. But the other was the disinformation campaign that was run by the Russian troll farms, which was creating animosity and hostility between groups of Americans. The story I like to tell is the fake Black Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter rallies that the Russians spun up in the city of Dallas across the street from each other. Neither was legitimate. Both were parlayed across the internet, and adherents here in the United States, thinking that they were supporting their cause, went to these rallies, and then they were across the street from each other, and a big fight developed. This was all Russian inspired, and it's just a vignette or an anecdote of what they've been doing for a long time. And people need to understand that this has been Russia's signature for a long time. They did it in the country of Estonia. They did it in the country of Georgia. They did it in Germany. They did it in France. They've got it all over the world. They are committed to restoring the former Soviet Union. And to do that, they need to destroy democracy and disable NATO. That's their playbook and their strategy. And one of the ways you destroy democracy is you destroy people's faith in elections. So it was because of that experience that in 2018 and 2019, we at Pitt Cyber formed the bipartisan election security project for Pennsylvania. It's more Republicans than Democrats, geographically distributed, co-chaired by Paul McNulty, who was a Republican U.S. Attorney in the Bush administration and Deputy Attorney General, and me. And we went about our business to try and figure out how we could make elections more secure in Pennsylvania because we were worried about the Russian threat. Turned out that became the platform for how we voted in the pandemic. But the ultimate irony, I think, is that there are people now who wave the American flag who are engaged in the exact same behavior as the Russians, and they're hurting themselves and hurting our country.
And John, I'd ask you, you're spending a lot of time outside of Wisconsin working with partners and allies overseas as they build up their judicial processes. Maybe you could speak a moment to that great work and just how the world, from your perspective, is looking at America grappling with our understanding of rule of law and a federal Department of Justice.
Yes, Ari, I do a lot of projects, as you alluded to, for various groups, all rule of law projects. And I was just most recently in India with judges and high court justices from 5 Asian countries it's part of a long couple-year project on counterterrorism. And clearly what they're looking to is for the kind of experience that Dave just shared, so we can share our ideas and share thoughts. And everybody, and these are really, I've been to all these countries before. I'd written a counterterrorism assessment through the State Department for the country of Bangladesh after the Holy Artisan Bakery murders in 2015. And they have the similar problems what we have. Interestingly, at the most recent conference, we had a good presentation on artificial intelligence, how it can be used and how it can be used in the judicial system, how it can be used, maybe by the other side, by the bad guys, in terms of modeling and disinformation. We were also discussing how it could be used affirmatively to disrupt terrorist groups. So and Dave is so right, it is all about information in my boiling it all down. The anger that people have, the fear they have about fraud, I think, is based primarily on disinformation and lack of information. It's part of our push here in Wisconsin to keep our republic is understand what your 1,800 voting officials do. Understand how there's paper ballots. Understand how the machines are really very safe. But people don't understand that. And with whoever the bad actor is, it's all about pushing that disinformation. The use of artificial intelligence to further that is really pretty frightening, I think. So I think other countries are looking to us because they believe that we, as a general rule, figure this stuff out. In 2012, I made a speech in Kenya to a couple hundred people. They were about to go into an election where they had really horrible violence, ended up in war crimes charges at The Hague from the prior election. And I talked about our history of peaceful transition. And I showed the video of President Bush welcoming President-elect Obama with the other former presidents, Republican and Democrat. And I said, this is what it looks like. I didn't envision that becoming dated so quickly and frighteningly, but I think that's the message. They looked to us. They were shocked when our electoral process, while it worked, was under attack. Some of them, my friends, when I was working in Egypt, would say things like, well, this is not so surprising. And I'm like, okay, no, we're not Egypt. we're trying to be a leader. And I think we can, but it does go back just what Dave said. It's about how information is provided, because people who are thinking a certain way now will tunnel in and, as we all know, get their information from various online sources that just repeat the message they want to hear. And that's difficult to break.
Well, let me ask you both the final question. The show is called If We Can Keep It, and that's an allusion to what was posed on the streets of Philadelphia to Ben Franklin after the Constitutional Convention when he said it's a republic if we, the citizenry, can keep it. So as you look at the next year, knowing just how fragile this democracy as we approach our 250th birthday is, generally optimistic? I don't want to put you on the spot. Are there anything specific? I'll pose another question. Is there anything specifically average everyday citizens can do to help fortify this fragile experiment we call a democracy?
Go ahead, John.
I'm an optimist. I always have been. I'm my mother's son. When it's storming, we see a blue sky in the horizon. So I am optimistic. I think in my home state, I think some good can come just from the fact that we're all talking about our fears, just from the fact that even people who are angry about the election, everybody's at least talking about it. Now, from our part, at Keep Our Republic, our goal is to try and message the facts. As I said, there's 1,800 people from county to city to village to towns who run our elections in Wisconsin. It's a complicated process, but people need to know how it works. It's not all these computers and hackers and stuff. It's real paper ballots that back up everything. I want people to be talking about it. The group I alluded to that wants, as there are many places, they want it to be all paper ballots. And I remind them, we trust technology in our cars and our appliances and how we pay our bills, how we email and call each other. Why wouldn't we trust it properly run in the most fragile, most important thing we do, which is run our country, run our voting? So you can't turn the clock back. It's not going to be 18 where we get on our horse and we ride through the mud and we hand something to a neighbor. So I am optimistic because I think just people talking, even if we don't agree with what they're saying, if they want to say, turn the clock back, then we can say, well, let's talk about that. Maybe people don't listen. There's always going to be angry people. I just want them angry at the result. That's always been my message. If the process is fair and you don't like how it turned out, then get more votes the next time and we trust the process again. That's what we need to return to. People angry at their guy lost. Well, then next time they're going to get a better man or woman and hopefully get more votes. So I am an optimist tempered with the fact that I've been proven wrong before.
I'm in the same place. I'm an optimist, but I'm alarmed at some of the things I still see on social media and on the internet. And I hate to think that we need another big event in this country to bring the country back together, big negative circumstance like 9/11 or something. But we seem to be divided in ways that are really alarming to me. And I think that what ordinary citizens can do, I think they did in 2022, is they stepped up as patriots to fill the positions in the election offices around the country. And they supported the people who were doing that. At Pitt Cyber, we did a program with Brad Raffensperger and another program with Jocelyn Benson, two of the secretaries of state who were under siege in 2020. And Al Schmidt, who's our Secretary of State now, was also a guest in one of our programs. And those programs are still online. It would be good for people to just go back and listen to deal with the granular horror of what was happening. Jocelyn Benson was in her house in Michigan with her young 5-year-old son when a bunch of people and trucks with guns pulled up. And the question was, the Michigan State Police going to defend her? Their governor was the subject of an assassination plot that everybody read about. These are just unexpected outrages that we would have never imagined. And as John said, when you go around the world, there are also embarrassments to our country because we are, as the citadel of democracy and the example of free elections. There was a time whenever there was an election in a struggling, emerging country, Americans were brought in to teach them how to do democracy. And we got to go back to learning. But on a more fundamental level, if you look at the assaults on teachers, the assaults on officials in youth sporting events, we've lost our ability to compete and say, let's live to fight another day and let's win next time if we lose this time. Litigating the results of these things to the point of fault. I think we need to really re-embrace the founding principles and the warning of Ben Franklin from 1776 through 1789, that we've created this experiment in American democracy, but it is up to us at this time to make sure we can keep it.
Well, gentlemen, I really I appreciate the time, the perspective, and everything you're doing to help keep it. I'm reminded of what President Roosevelt said, that the credit belongs to those in the arena, and you certainly got some dirt under your fingernails being in that arena. So thank you again.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you, Ari. It was my pleasure.